For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on! Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're reading chapter 24, Into Darkness. Boom! The whole wood shook. Snow rolled, the trees swayed, and flocks of sparrows took to the sky. Nick and Comet spun around, peering through the trees. There was so much black smoke billowing around, swelling up into the sky. Nick's throat went dry and his voice hoarse. What was that? Comet's body got tense and his brown fur stuck up like needles. He kept his eyes toward the black smoke, snorting. Comet, what is it, boy? Boom! Came a second explosion, and that's when it was clear that it was coming from the dwelling. Nick picked himself up and ran, Comet galloping to keep up. They sprinted back through the trees between jumps and leaps, not stopping until they reached the barn. Nick snuck behind the tall, wide shelter that was chipping with red paint and reeking of cow manure. He and Comet crept along the exterior until they were able to peek out from behind it. The dwelling was on fire, the roof collapsed, and all of his friends were in the snowy yard on their knees, chained. Belsnickel paced the yard while fluttering his fingers as a form of intimidation. 3 Yetis stood to the side like soldiers, with white shaggy fur tumbling down their enormous bodies. Where is he? Belsnickel waited for a response, but didn't receive one. I said, where is he? Again, nothing. He marched over to Emma and grabbed a clump of her red hair. He yanked her into the yard, her screams causing Nick to clench his fists. Where is he, girl? He grabbed her face, his yellow nails digging into her cheeks. He pressed his wrinkled forehead against hers while leering into her eyes. Don't make me ask again. Emma hawked a loogie and spat, grinning while watching her mucus dribbling from Belsnickel's bald head and down his heated face. The elf slapped her, hurling her face first on the snow. Nick stepped into a run when Comet grabbed his boot with his teeth and tugged him back. Emma lifting herself back up, her face smeared with snow, and spotted Nick hiding behind the barn. They caught eyes, and then she mouthed, Gilbert's satchel. She subtly tilted her head towards the dwelling, where the fire had migrated to several more rooms. Take them, Belsnickel barked at the 3 Yeti. Take them to the harbor, and put them on a first ship destined for the North Pole. Let Lord Avamork have his fun with them. As for Nick, his voice calmed while his leer swept across every elf, human, witch, Yule Cat, and Field Mouse who had helped Nick along his journey. Let him be a coward. He cracked a smile of rotten teeth. That's what he is, a coward. You understand? You've all put your faith in a coward. His grin grew slightly wider, but just as twisted. It's so sad, it's almost amusing. Still chortling, Belsnickel boarded the front seat of a carriage and instructed the driver to head to the harbor. The Yeti escorted all of Nick's friends into the back of the carriage and crammed them all in, slamming the door shut behind them. The carriage jerked into a roll before it set off. Nick ran into the yard, in front of the burning, shambled home where his mother was raised, watching the carriage roll down the road and toward Murmansk's harbor. There is no one left. Not Emma, not Gilbert, nobody. The fate of his friends, and even the world, was left on him, and him alone. He watched the carriage disappear off in the distance, listening to the crackling fire as it swallowed the dwelling, numb to it all. Comet grunted, but Nick didn't stir. He grunted again, snorting with cold puffs blasting from his nostrils. Nick was too lost in his own mind to notice. Comet hit the ground running. He charged through the snow and headbutted Nick right into the tush. The calf then pointed his snout over to the burning house. Gilbert's satchel, he remembered. Nick ran to the front door and went to grab for the knob, but it scorched him. And then he used his shoulder and rammed against it with his whole body, bursting it open. The ceiling was now engulfed in flames and thick, black smoke tumbled around the room. Nick ducked into the smog, beams falling and walls collapsing all around him. He crawled through the inferno, coughing hard as he inhaled the fumes. His eyes burned and his throat dried, and he started to feel dizzy. He pushed himself further, dragging himself on hands and knees. He found his way into the dining room and table capsized, shards of shattered dishes crunching against his hands. He spotted Gilbert's satchel on the floor nearby. He crawled toward it, coughing and sputtering through the smoke. Wood splintered, the fire crackled, and windows began to burst. Nick got to the satchel and snatched it. He then climbed to his feet, tucked his nose under his sweatshirt, and ran out of the house just as it became totally consumed in the engulfing flames. Nick threw himself back out of the snowy yard where Cupid's sleigh stood waiting. The Siberian Huskies were all harnessed and reined, Coda ready to lead his team. Comet sat in the sleigh, grunting. Nick climbed in, wiping the soot from his face. He dropped Gilbert's satchel in the back seat and then grabbed the leather reins. He liked the feeling he got when he held them. "Coda," he called out in the front of the team. "You ready?" The terrier nodded. "Then what are we waiting for? We got a boat to catch." He slapped the reins, shouting, "Mush!" Coda barked and the Huskies howled, and then the terrier took off with his team following his lead. The dogs pounded the snow, their movements synchronized as one. They headed onward, changing course only by Nick's orders. The crimson sleigh cut through the snow like a ship at sea. The frosty wind blew through Nick's hair and Comet's fur, the cold bombarding on their faces, but they didn't care. There was something about that sleigh, something that made both Nick and Comet feel alive. Nick slapped the reins again, signaling Coda to pick up his speed. The terrier did so, and the Huskies matched his pace. "Wahoo!" Nick shouted, and even that shout sounded freeing. "Wahoo!" he screamed even louder, laughing while listening to his own voice ringing back. The dog sled team went down the road, through sprawling farmlands where cows and horses watched them speed by. The fields of crops soon began to fade away, and cottages emerged before becoming a lively city full of buildings and taverns. Coda led them down a narrow street, amongst tall brick buildings, until they finally arrived at the edge of town, where they were met with a magnificent harbor. The sleigh screeched to a halt as the dog sled's team's heels dug into the ice. Nick and Comet jumped up. They raced down the dock until they had to stop before falling into the ocean. Out in the distance was a cargo ship. Black smog puffed out of its smokestacks while it headed towards the horizon. They were too late. Nick began to tear up, his teardrops falling, then splashing on the wood-paneled dock. "Comet, what are we going to do?" The calf nudged Nick's leg with his head, tears falling from his eyes as well. "We missed our chance." Nick's tears began to sparkle, and then so did Comet's. Their tears drifted together, collecting before their very eyes. Nick hadn't even realized how much he had cried. All their tears gathering up into a liquid-like orb that shined and sparkled. The orb crystallized in the freezing cold. It became too heavy and dropped at Nick's feet. He crouched to his knees and reached for the frosted orb. Confused by his ghostly, frozen reflection, he reached out to touch it. They vanished. Nick and Comet reappeared on the deck of the ship, puzzled. Nick was holding the orb, but it was now cracked, and the ghoulish silhouette of his reflection was gone. He tossed it overboard, then quickly hid behind a crate just as a Yeti came patrolling by. It smelled awful on deck, and it left Nick's eyes irritated. He tried to breathe from his mouth, all while Comet was gagging. "Shh!" Nick held a finger up to his lips, silencing Comet. They both snuck a peek from around the crate, finding a bunch more cargo containers lined along the upper deck. 3 Yeti were patrolling the ship, doing their rounds and monitoring for any suspicious activity. At the back of the iron ship was a small tower with many windows. Through those windows, Nick could see where the crew slept, cooked, ate, and also where the wheelhouse was located. The captain was currently in that room, directing the ship on course to the North Pole. Nick recognized the captain as the same one from the SS Vixen. "We need to hide." He peeked around, ducking behind a cargo container as the Yeti came back around. Nick rounded the iron crate. It was a long, rectangular container, and it opened up in the back. Nick and Comet quickly snuck inside. It was a long journey through the Arctic Ocean, and a bumpy one at that. The ship rocked in the turbulent waves, water crashing onto the upper deck, spraying the Yeti, who became angry and roared in frustration. On the first day, Nick was seasick, however got better soon after, mainly because he had nothing left to throw up, and his stomach truly settled on the 3rd day after growing accustomed to the raging sea. It had been several days now, but luckily the container they had taken shelter in was stocked with barrels of raw fruits and vegetables, so they didn't go hungry. By the 4th day, Nick was starting to feel a little wonky. He had no one else but Comet to talk to, and Comet, being just a reindeer calf, hadn't anything to say. He was starting to really question his sanity, when finally the ship docked. They waited in the container for a while, listening to the Yeti roaring about, and Belznickel began barking orders. There was a ruckus, but over a long hour it started to quiet down. Nick and Comet took the quiet as an opportunity. They opened the container and were instantly hit by a freezing wind chill that they could feel all the way down to their bones. Nick hugged himself while venturing toward a railing. They were docked along a bed of ice. All his eyes could see was an infinite sprawling desert of ice. Silver carriages, reined by Harness's reindeer, were parked in front of the ship, awaiting further commands. The Yeti filed the prisoners from the ship to the ice. Nick spotted Mr. McTwizzle, and then Cupid, Befana following short after. Bartholomew trailed the witch with the Pransley family right behind him. Nick's heart skipped a beat. Emma was sporting a freshly bruised eye and a cut. Gilbert sat on her shoulder with tiny shackles clamped around his claws. As the Yeti shoved them all into the back of the carriages, Belsnickel took to a private coach. He sat on a leather seat, enjoying chocolate-covered strawberries along with a flute of bubbling champagne. The carriages took off. The reindeer hauled their coaches in a straight line along a frosted road and up a hill before disappearing off into the unknown. Nick and Comet went down a ramp and onto the bed of ice, and then they began after the carriages on foot. Nick had never felt so cold in all of his life. His nose was red, his cheeks blue, and he felt the start of frostbite on the tips of each of his toes. They ventured on, trudging through the snow. Comet was growing tired. His hooves were cold and his nose wet. The wind howled in chilling gusts, lashing them both in their faces. It started to snow, and it grew aggressively fast. The wind swished and whooshed. Whirling snowflakes got into Nick's eyes, tampering his vision and violating his sense of direction. He halted, then spun around. The land was white, the sky a reflection, and a flurry of snow whirled and gusted all around them. It all started to look the same. Nick twirled around and then around again, darting his eyes every which direction. He had been following the carriage's tracks for hours, but they disappeared off into the blizzard. The wind moaned like ghosts, whipping Nick's face, tousling his golden hair. He couldn't be sure which way the carriages had gone, or even which way they would lead back to the ship. He couldn't even feel his feet. The numbness spread up his legs to his thighs, reaching to his belly button, and that's when he really started to panic. Nick found Comet trailing behind. The poor calf was shivering, head bowed, snow buried up to his little pot belly. "Comet!" Nick fell to the snow. He tore off his jacket and wrapped the calf up, experiencing new depths of cold he didn't know were possible. He scooped him up and held him in his arms. "It's all right. Everything will be all right." He could feel Comet trembling against his chest. "Hang on, buddy." Nick picked a direction and went for it. The wind was becoming even more violent, and the blizzard crueler. His teeth chattered and his legs shook, but he kept Emma and Gilbert and all of the children on his mind, igniting a flame in his heart that fought against the blistering cold. He plodded through the snow, but it was rising fast. The frost had now reached up to his knees, and it slowed him down even more. He squeezed Comet tighter, rubbing the calf to make sure he stayed warm. A mighty gust threw Nick to his knees. The cold wind beat his face while the snow began to bury him. "Nick!" A soft voice rang in his head, so clear it could be heard over the roaring blizzard. "Nick!" He could hear it, a familiar voice in his head, and yet also to the right of him. "You're almost there, Nick. You're almost there." A new fire ignited inside him. He turned right and began to trek toward the voice. The blizzard was strong, and it was only growing more hazardous. The wind tossed fiercely, with swirls of heavy clumps of snow pounding Nick as hard as pebbles. It was becoming dark, near pitch black, but he kept going, kept fighting. Just when all seemed lost, he stumbled upon a glowing cave carved out into the side of a glacier. Nick carried Comet inside. It was a long and hollow tunnel with glowing crystals protruding from the walls and spiking from the ceiling. "Nick," came the voice again, sounding like it was coming from down in the cavern's deep bowels. Nick set Comet down, the little calf following him as he started through the tunnel. "My sweet boy, how far you've come!" He continued, trudging into the dark that became more and more illuminated by all of the glowing crystals. Nick's voice echoed in the shadows. "Who's there?" "You're almost there, sweetheart. You're almost there." He ran towards the dark, his voice ringing back. "Almost where?" "Home." Nick halted, the darkness wilting as the tunnel brightened. He could now see where he was. He was standing in a circular cavern, the craveness, void, emptiness aside from two pearly white coffins, sealed in granite and layered in ice. Standing between the caskets, a heavenly presence glimmering in silver sparkles and golden rays, was a familiar nun. Nick could feel his eyes trembling before letting a tear drop. "Sister Merriweather?" She opened her arms. "Hello, Nick." He ran through a thin layer of snow and threw himself into the nun's embrace. He cried into her chest while squeezing her hard. "I thought I'd never see you again." "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered softly. "Seeing is only one sense, but there are so many others." She pulled back to show her smile, all while smearing Nick's tears dry with her hands. "You might not be able to see me, but there wasn't a moment I wasn't with you, in here." She pressed her palm firmly against his chest, covering his heart. "I was always with you." Her smile was so warm and so mother-like that it left Nick realizing how very much he missed her. "I was there when you visited Mr. McToozle's emporium of fantastic trinkets and toys, and on board the SS Vixen sailing to Europe. I visited the Pransley family with you, and strolled through Dunder Woods with you. We were together when we met Befana the Witch and Bartholomew the Yule Cat, and I even traveled with you on the Blitzen Express. We fought gremlins beside each other, and Yeti too." She crouched down and stroked Comet, the calf's eyes fluttering as the nun gave him a good scratch behind his ear. "And I even led a sweet little calf to you, because I knew you were needing another friend." She lifted back up and cupped Nick's cold, rosy cheek. "Don't you see, Nick? I've been with you all along." "It's not the same," he cried. "No, it's not." Sister Meriwether took his hand and squeezed it hard. "But what a wonderful thing it still is." She strolled off, hands tucked quaintly in her shroud, as she worked her way around the icy cavern coated in jagged, glowing crystals. "Oh, Nick, how much you've grown in just a few weeks. I remember the little baby who was left on my doorstep, who used to race into my bedroom after being frightened by a nightmare, who loves strongly, who cares deeply, and has now grown, dare I say, into a man." Nick followed the nun between the two pearly white caskets, and there they could see those who were laid to rest, slumbering forever beneath a sheet of ice. The first, a gorgeous woman with golden hair tumbling down to her lower back, with pink lips and fair skin, donned in a beautiful gown the color of an evergreen tree. A memorial plate was mounted to the side of the white granite, reading, "Here lies Aurora Pepperplum, the most magical human the North Pole has ever seen." The second coffin contained a brown-haired elf with bushy eyebrows and a kept beard, the same shade of color, wearing a crimson-colored tunic layered with a long black cape. He was at least a foot taller than Nick, with long pointy ears, rosy cheeks, and even, during his everlasting sleep, wore a happy smile compared to the one tugging on Nick's blistering lips. His memorial plate read, "Here lies St. Nicholas CLAUS, leader of elves, defender of children, a warrior who ruled with only his heart." "Isn't he handsome?" noted Sister Meriwether. "He inherited our mother's beauty, but our father's belly." Her voice bounced by a giggle deep in her throat. "So many times I told him to lay off the cookies. He was cursed with a sweet tooth." She watched Nick hover over his father's casket, with trembling eyes pooling with tears. "You remind me of him." Nick looked up and met his aunt's gaze. "I do?" "Quite a lot, actually." Sister Meriwether shared a story. "Back when we were teenagers, your father and I spent a lot of time together. Avamork was just a baby, but Nicholas and I were closer in age. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't like playing sports or going hunting for Arctic hares, or even fishing for Arctic graylings. None of that ever interested him. He spent most of his time in the elven community, helping wherever he could. It wasn't unusual for Nicholas to be seen at the village bakery, frosting cakes to help Pinky Twinklebeam with her steady orders of Danish cakes, or filling in for Charles Crackles at the Museum of Natural Magical History, while Mr. Crackles recovered at St. Nikolai's Memorial Hospital from a knee replacement. He could be down in the basements of the Great Hall assisting Figgy Pepperplum with organizing records and dating scrolls, or even be helping Miss Doodles grade papers at the Archimedes Academy of Aspiring Young Elves. She stopped listing them after noticing Nick was having a tough time following along with so many different people and places. The point is, your father enjoyed helping others, just like you, Nick. He looked away. "I don't know how helpful I've ever been." Sister Meriwether tilted her head slightly and looked at Nick with a motherly love and a smile. "For 15 years I watched you, helping Joey with his homework, or Toby with his confidence, Gilbert with his gadgets, or consoling Holly with her nightmares, and helping Abigail build oh so many dollhouses." Sister Meriwether looked past Nick, and even then into a moment only she could see. "I swear it was like seeing my brother alive again. Why didn't you tell me? He commanded the nun's attention with a stern voice. You knew everything. So why did you keep it from me? Sister Meriwether wrapped around her brother's coffin, gazing through the sheet of ice and at Nicholas's joyful grin. The night I found you on the doorsteps of Lost Star Orphanage, Avamort came to bring you back. He knew where you were. It was Christmas morning, and I knew you would be back that very evening. To protect you, I cast an enchantment over the orphanage. It was an unseen barrier of protection that shielded the building from enemies who wished to harm you. To keep that enchantment from breaking took a lot of daily focus and concentration. But over the years I got older, and my magic weaker, and eventually the enchantment sizzled out. That was the night Avamort came. That doesn't explain why you didn't tell me. Magic isn't perfect, Nick, she stressed. It has limitations, just as you've discovered along your journey. She deepened her explanation. The enchantment I cast that night not only blinded you from your enemies, but blinded you from magic. That was the flaw in the enchantment's design. It would protect you only if you didn't know it existed. She touched her chest, her heart melting as she looked into Nick's droopy eyes. I wasn't trying to keep it from you. I was only trying to protect you. Nick didn't know what to make of it. He was still angry, but he was so tired of being angry. His friends were still in danger, and they needed him. Auntie, you're my aunt? Nick looked at her with a hopeful stare. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get our family back? The stone, she said. Avamort wants to take the stone from you, to reunite it with the Northern Staff. He wants to open the gates of Twilight Bridge. That's what he's been after. That's what he's always been after. But I don't have the stone, confessed Nick. Yes, you do, Sister Meriwether corrected, surprising him. I was the one who found you the night Mr. McTwizzle placed you on the doorstep of Lost Star Orphanage. I had started a new life for myself far from CLAUS Village as a nun caring for orphan children. I knew my sister-in-law was pregnant with you, and I knew I would miss your birth. I had planned to visit after winter had fallen, but would never get the chance. I hadn't gotten to meet you yet, and so when I found you on the doorstep, I wasn't sure who you were. That is, not until I found what was tucked in your blanket. Nick's face screwed. What are you talking about? The stone of the Northern Staff was in your blanket, not because someone put it there, but because you called for it. Me? Sputtered Nick. No, that can't be right. I was just a baby. A baby more magical than any creature in this world. Nick's past felt like a dark room. But the more Sister Meriwether shared with him, the more light came through. The Northern Staff is the most powerful object in the world, but the staff is useless without the stone. It has been passed down in the CLAUS family every generation since the death of St. Nikolai, given to the firstborn who would take the staff and rule elfinkind. You might have only been a baby, but when Avamort murdered your father, you became the reigning saint. The Northern Staff was rightfully yours, only days old, and somehow you knew this. Your magic called for the stone. It vanished from the staff and into your blanket. It came to its rightful owner. But if the stone was with me as a baby, where is it now? Sister Meriwether revealed, your snow globe. My snow globe? Asked Nick, reaching into Gilbert's satchel and fetching it. I don't understand. The nun took it, twisting the frosted sphere loose. You are a baby born from two worlds, a magical creature unlike any seen before, and yet you couldn't know that magic existed. I had to protect you. She spun the orb until it popped apart from its wooden base, and so I kept it safe until the day would come when I would give it back to you. The stand was hollowed out, and inside rested a bright ruby stone. Nick reached in and grasped the stone, feeling a warmth in his hand that jolted through the entire being. It's yours, Nick. It's always been yours. Sister Meriwether fixed the two pieces of the snow globe back together, then stowed it away in Gilbert's satchel. Nick held the stone in his hand, no longer cold because the warmth of the stone overpowered the chill he had gotten from the Arctic blizzard. Even Comet stood mesmerized by the glittering ruby gem. Nick looked up at his aunt and asked, What am I supposed to do with this? You take back CLAUS Village. She noticed Nick's hesitance as he gazed into the gleaming piece of rock. The stone is powerful, but only because it enhances what's already there. You are part elf, Nick, which means you can bend magic to your will. You have to find your spark, but you'll only do that once you start learning to believe in yourself. She approached him slowly, her black cloak ruffling around her heels. Nick, it's time for you to embrace who you are, and who you were always meant to be. You are Nicholas Claus, a descendant of St. Nikolai, ruler of elfinkind, rightful wielder of the Northern Staff. She cupped his cheek and faded away into silver sparkles and golden rays. Just as her image diminished, she smiled as warmly as a proud mother. You just have to believe. Sister Meriwether was gone. the cavern turned dark again. Warmth had left Nick's body, and a frosty chill found him once more. His teeth chattered and his body shivered. It was darker than a shadow. He couldn't see anything beyond Comet trembling near the granite coffins, his parents' final resting place. He was still holding the stone, but somehow it had lost its brightness. Magic was fading. He was uncertain of himself, his strengths, and his abilities, as doubt sat heavily on his shoulders. "I'm just an orphan," he kept repeating to himself. "I'm not a warrior or a leader. I'm not anything." The stone dimmed again, and wind and snow came gusting into the cavern, chilling them even more. "I'm just an orphan." A tear froze halfway down his rosy cheek. Nothing more than an orphan. Just when the stone's light was about to snuff out, Nick noticed Comet shivering even harder than before. In that moment, he knew the calf was dying. "Comet!" The calf's blue eyes started to fold closed, trembling so hard he was nearly convulsing. "Comet!" Nick fell to the cavern's icy floor. He located his jacket on the ground, buried in the snow, and wrapped Comet tightly up in it. He scooped him up and carried him again. "I'm so sorry, Comet. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." Nick shivered hard. "I shouldn't have taken us here." The stone suddenly brightened in Nick's hand. Just a little, but still illuminating enough to catch his and the calf's attention. "Come on," he hugged Comet tightly. "Let's get you out of here." Nick headed straight for the darkness. He trudged through the snow, slipping on patches of ice while fighting his way through blustering chills of icy wind. His body wanted to give up, but he knew Comet would die if he did. He pushed himself even harder. The wind lashed his face and snow rose to his knees. He caught a speck of daylight at the end of the tunnel, the break of dawn, and headed for it. The more he pushed himself, the more the stone warmed and brightened. Nick could feel it giving him strength. More warmth emitted from the stone and seeped into his hand, slowly working through his entire body. It was a feeling, a familiar one at that, and that feeling was giving him the strength he didn't know he had. "It's love," he realized. "My spark is love." He had wanted to give up, and his feelings of unworthiness had weakened him, but his love for Comet reignited his inner flame. By the time Nick carried the calf out of the cave and into the morning sun, neither of them was cold at all. Comet leapt up from Nick's arms, prancing in the snow with a resurgence of life, looking just as brave as a fully grown reindeer. Nick looked up into the sky, washed in the morning sunlight. "My spark is love." Another burst of tingling warmth jetted up his spine and then back again. Emma, Gilbert, and then all the children from Lost Star Orphanage passed through his mind in a reel of images. The more he thought of them, the more his fingers began to prickle. Night had fallen, and the morning rose, but still a lone star sat in the sky above them. Nick smiled when he saw it. "That way," he pointed to the direction of the lone star. "CLAUS village is that way." Comet lifted up to his hind legs and then pounded his hooves into the snow. "Let's go." They took off, sprinting through a frozen valley tucked away between tall, crackling glaciers. Nick was running in the snow, dressed only in slacks and a wool sweatshirt, and yet he wasn't cold at all. He never felt so strong. His body felt renewed and electrified. He could feel his heart pulsing, along with a prominent static tingling at his fingertips. He had stepped out of a shell of doubt and into a boundless body of infinite possibilities. He was becoming who he was always meant to be. His family and friends flashed across his mind again. He was a boy, part human, part elf, who wanted to protect those he loved. Nick and Comet continued through the valley, stopping a family of wild polar bears at the top of the tall glaciers to look and watch the odd pair passing through. Neither Nick nor Comet felt tired. In fact, they could have both run for miles, but the valley ended at a large pool of water. Nick approached the edge, eyes trained ahead. There was an enormous frozen island drifting before them, surrounded by a mountain of colossal glaciers. Nick knew that's where they needed to go and could only think of one way to get there. His energy soared. His embrace of who he was gave him vigor and clarity of thought. Nick reached into Gilbert's satchel and found the dagger forged with a jagged coal blade. He dropped to his knees and drove the dagger straight through the ice, sending into action a network of fissures. Nick ripped the dagger free, lifted himself up, and stomped on the frosted ground, breaking them off from the pack ice onto a patch of free-floating ice. As they stood on the ice, it began to move forward at the command of Nick's thoughts. He wanted it to take them to the island, and so the floating ice drifted them toward it. The water was calm as they smoothly sailed above a pod of orcas. The closer they drew to the island, the bigger and taller the glaciers became. In fact, they were so large that they would have put the buildings back in New York City to shame. Nick spotted an opening that would have been impossible to see from the shore, and the patch of ice drifted them inside. Alright, you guys, we finished. We have one more chapter left, so tomorrow we're going to have the grand finale, chapter 25, CLAUS Village.